first thing I want to do, I guess, is just thank our host, Tab, for this, and all the trouble and the work and the effort that they go to provide these knowledge events, these value-added events. I really commend you for your efforts in that area, and I wish you every continued success in the future. I want to thank you as well for including me in today's program. Do you believe, as I do, that all great leadership is transformational? That high-impact leaders are never really content with things just the way they are. I'm convinced that the best leaders have what I like to call a kind of a healthy discontent with the status quo. They're always leading change. Driven by a strong vision and mission orientation, they always take teams to new ground. Now, this kind of leadership is not safe. Never has been, never will be. We might maybe think about leadership a little bit like we think about investing in the market. The higher the risk, the higher the return. And yet, today, I see far too many leaders who seem to me much more concerned with playing it safe, with looking after their own interests, than they are with really making a difference. There are endless managers who seemingly don't want to do anything that could put them at personal risk. They make for impotent leaders. They want promotions, they want advancement, but they don't want to take the chances that you have to take to really become an impact player, a person who really makes a difference. So what kind of chances am I talking about? What kind of risks am I talking about? Early in my career, I was working as vice president at the Edmonton Journal. Working as an advertising manager at the Edmonton Journal. So that's one step below a VP. I had a staff of about 70 people when I was approached to take the same job in Vancouver at the Vancouver Sun and Province. It meant a bigger staff, and it meant more money. I remember back there being a young guy and being very excited about the fact that this was going to be the first time I was going to crack the six-figure barrier, and I was pretty excited about that back then. But I had a guy as an early mentor, one of the few people I will describe as a mentor in my life, the man who was then the president and publisher of the Edmonton Journal. He was a guy named Don Babbitt. And Don gave me a great piece of advice that I think I've offered to hundreds of people over the years. Don said, Dan, I would think about two things when you're thinking about a new job. He said, first of all, think about the man or woman that you're going to go to work for. What does he or she have to teach you? And then he said, the second thing is think about the job itself. What does it have to teach you? And then he said, the job, it's a bigger staff, it's more money, but it's the same job you have here in Edmonton. And he wasn't really convinced that the vice president in Vancouver was really a good fit for me. Well, about the same time, I got another opportunity that came along. I was approached to interview for the position of director of advertising at the Kingston Whig Standard. To my colleagues, it was, as we might say, a no-brainer. You see, at the time, Southern was divided into two different divisions. There were what we called the metros, and those were the 5 big markets. So they included Vancouver, which was the Sun and Province, the Edmonton Journal, the Calgary Herald, the Ottawa Citizen, and the Montreal Gazette. And then there were these other 11 smaller newspapers that were unofficially known in the company as the SLIMs. SLIM was an acronym. It stood for Small Little Insignificant Markets. Nobody moved from a metro to a SLIM. But I thought about Don's advice. Kingston was indeed a smaller paper, but it was going to be my first opportunity to lead a department, report directly to the president and publisher. While I didn't know the publisher, it was also an integration. We had purchased the newspaper from a local family, the Davies family in Kingston, and while I knew nothing about integrations, I thought there has got to be something to be learned from this, and it sounded kind of cool to me. Well, let me tell you, there sure was, and I'll share that lesson in a couple minutes. So I said no to Vancouver, and I moved my family 2,000 miles east to Kingston, Ontario for a lot less money. The 6 figures were going to have to wait a little while. I think I took a risk at that point that a lot of other people were discouraging me from taking. Like, Dan, why would you take yourself out of the big leagues and go back to the minor leagues? People don't do that. But I was thinking a little bit about Don's advice. At Kingston, the company was playing a very deliberate play it safe strategy. You see, corporate office believed that the purchase of the Whig, which, as you might appreciate, was a really old, storied Canadian newspaper title in the epicenter of Canada's United Empire Loyalist community. They don't like change a lot in Kingston. But that purchase by a corporate interest, they believed, would be very sensitive, and so they adopted this don't rock the boat approach. They installed a company publisher, a fiery Irishman whose name was Jake Doherty, and then they determined to maintain the status quo, change nothing, for 3 years. I was part of an integration team that was assembled to go in at the 3-year mark and lead the changes that Southam had planned. Well, while we had a pretty successful run in the advertising department, the overall integration really was a bit of a train wreck. People in the community just never came to accept the change in ownership. As I thought about it, it was really more than anything else a flaw in strategy. You see, in determining to do nothing, to take no risks, we didn't do anything to demonstrate to the community or the staff that this change in ownership was good. We didn't give them a reason to feel good about the change. So that experience would turn out for me to be really foundational to my own approach to integrations. I left Kingston and I spent a year at our head office as the director of sales for those 11 Slims. I was appointed to a new position that was really designed to help lead a lot of change across those 11 smaller newspapers. That then led to my first appointment as president and publisher to the top job at the St. Catharines Standard. It was the newest Slim, and it would prove to be my second integration. This was the only integration that I got to lead. I've had a really pretty close-up experience with 4 integrations, but this was the only one where I really got to lead the integration from start to finish. I took the keys on day one when our company bought the newspaper from another local family, the Burgoyne family of St. Catharines. The strategic planning sessions I remember that preceded the actual integration unfolded at the White Oaks Inn in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And I remember that a key question arose very early in the discussions. You see, we had plans to close the presses in St. Catharines and to move the printing to the Hamilton Spectator, which for those of you with a Southern Ontario background is about 45 minutes away down the Queen Elizabeth Highway. You see, the St. Catharines Standard was an afternoon newspaper, and it had the oldest remaining letterpress in the country, circa 1955, the same year as yours truly. The Hamilton Spectator was a morning newspaper, and it had a state-of-the-art $50 million offset press. So moving the printing from St. Catharines to Hamilton, avoiding the capital cost of a new press, getting the paper printed on a brand new state-of-the-art press, that's what made the deal make sense. That's what really made it make sense. So the big question that arose so early was, when are we going to tell people about our plans? My colleagues from corporate office felt very strongly that we should delay the announcement. So that would have meant delaying about 6 months. We took possession of the newspaper in April, and we weren't going to close the press until, as I recall, around October. We still wanted to make sure we honored the labor contracts that were in place, but they felt strongly that delaying was the sensible approach. I mean, why would you take the risk of alienating your employees and maybe the community and other stakeholders months in advance of your plans to actually close it? I argued, though, strongly that we needed to announce our plans on day one. You see, for me, it would have been so much easier just to agree with my corporate bosses and not fight quite so hard for this position, but I really felt it was a trust issue. If we delayed that announcement, I believed very strongly that our staff would know when we finally got around to telling them that we had withheld that information from them, and I believed I would have broken trust with them. I have always believed that trust is the glue that binds leaders and teams together. and we have to protect that at all costs. As I recall, we spent about a day and a half debating those options, and it was a pretty vigorous debate going back and forth across the table. And I remember very thankfully when they kind of looked up and said, all right, Dan, you're going to run it. So with some misgivings, we're going to do this your way, and we will go with your position. And then I remember we kind of turned our attention to, okay, how are we going to carry this off now that we've made this decision? And what we decided is that we would offer interviews to press operators in St. Catharines who had an interest in driving the distance to Hamilton to work at the Hamilton Spectator. Now, once again, we were going to offer interviews, not jobs. I was not going to put myself in a position of making promises that I couldn't keep. So no promises of a job, because there's a big difference between a modern offset press and an old letterpress. But we would give them interviews, and then we were going to offer a 4-week bonus on top of the severance formula for anybody who didn't want to drive to Hamilton but would stay through to the closure. So imagine, if you will, standing in front of the entire staff on the very first day that we owned the St. Catharines Standard in a crowded newsroom cluttered with papers, and everybody's up there from editorial and advertising and production and the business office, and announcing on that first day that we were going to close the press. I told people why we had made the choice and how we were going to go about it. It was really hard news for the first day, and it certainly made for a very eventful first day. We carried a story on the front page of our newspaper the next day. Closing the press is a big deal. In St. Catharines, the press room had a glass wall so that people in the community could walk by and see their newspaper coming off the presses. And it also meant the loss of quite a few local jobs. So it was a pretty safe bet that it wasn't going to be popular news. But you know, when I look back at that integration, I think that maybe was one of the most important decisions we made in the integration. I believe that people thought, that's tough news. That's tough news to hear on day one. But if he'll tell us that on day one, we can probably trust him. And I believe we built a foundation of trust on that day that we sustained for the 3 years that we were together there. I've long believed that truth is the foundation of trust. And truth can't be contingent on convenience. I have seen so many leaders sometimes say something, make a promise they couldn't keep, they couldn't deliver on because it seemed like salve for the wound at the time, or it seemed like the right thing to do. But later on, they couldn't deliver on it. And then later, they find themselves in a situation with broken trust. We made other big decisions early. I replaced 4 of the 6 vice presidents that reported directly to me, and several other changes throughout the management ranks. I have always, one of the, I guess, foundational beliefs for me is I have always believed that every team reflects its leadership. And so I put a lot of time and attention into trying to make sure that I had the best leaders and the best leadership team. And I set the bar very high on the leadership teams that I built across the country. Here in Calgary, the record would show that I replaced 4 of the 6 vice presidents that reported to me at the Herald. And over the first 2.5 years that we were together, I replaced about 40 of 70 members of the whole leadership team. So we had a staff of 700 people led by about 70 leaders. If you use the most all-inclusive definition of leadership, from a vice president down to a lead hand. And over the first 2.5 years, I replaced 4 of the 6 VPs and about 40 of the 70 leaders, in my efforts to try to make sure that everybody in the Herald, regardless of where they were, was getting skillful, principled leadership. Back in St. Catharines, we also introduced several other changes. We introduced monthly staff updates that were really well received by the team. We introduced weekly staff training. So I said to my my leaders on the team, I said, I want everybody in this newspaper to get at least 20 minutes a week of professional development. And I hold every leader here responsible to make sure that happens. And I said, it doesn't have to be fancy. You know, if you're running an editorial department, you can get 6 reporters together in a room and have them share notes on how they interview and learn from one another. That qualifies for me. But I want everybody to be participating in staff training and staff development. We embarked on an ambitious culture change initiative, and we involved the entire team in a redesign of the newspaper. And we did it all within the first 18 months that we were together. With the lessons of Kingston in hand, I wanted to get out of the gate fast. You know, if in Kingston we didn't give anybody a reason to think this was good, I didn't want to leave that to chance in St. Catharines. So I wanted to get out of the gate fast and give people lots of reasons inside the newspaper and across the community to feel good about the change in ownership. It worked. St. Catharines was Southam's most successful integration. We tripled the earnings of the newspaper over our first 3 years together and assembled a motivated, high-performing team that, when I look back on it even today, all these years later, it kind of brings a smile to my face. We built a team that punched well above its weight class, but we didn't make safe choices. We made lots of bold, provocative choices. The higher the risk, the higher the return. The St. Catharines Standard integration led to my appointment here in Calgary in May of 1999 as the president and publisher of the Calgary Herald, where I accepted the challenge of walking into, some of you won't remember this, some of you may, a very significant labor dispute. The newsroom, a staff of about 150 people, had organized a new union local about 6 months before my arrival, and both sides were stalled in contract negotiations that really weren't going anywhere. There was a lot of anger in parts of the newsroom. I remember the very first day I spent at the Herald. So the Herald had, it probably still does, a big cafeteria that is on the glass overlooking the city and looking west. It's a big cafeteria. And we planned this big transfer of command from Ken King to me on that day. And they had a big cake in the room, welcome Dan, good luck Ken type of thing. And I remember walking in there, it was my first day, walking in there, and two of the union organizers, senior staff of the Herald, walked across the room, glared at me. It's my first day at work. And said, you know your managers are actively walking around town talking about a strike? No hi, no I'm Andy, no let's shake your hand. I mean, this is my first day at work. So it was a little bit of a difficult situation. As we were getting ready for the likely dispute, I took an important call from Conrad Black and Don Babbitt, who was then, by then he was the COO of the whole company. And I remember it was on the parking lot of Big Four Motors on McLeod, and it was a warm summer day. And I told them that I wanted to take a hard stand against seniority language, and that I needed them to support me, and that I needed them to support me through to the end, no matter how hard it got. So they agreed, and the stage was set for what would turn out to be a very difficult 8-month strike. Likely would have been an awful lot easier not to challenge that union plank of seniority and just get on with things. You know, it's not easy to put a newspaper out for 236 days when your editorial department is on strike. And it doesn't get any easier when in the last 7 weeks, your entire production department, whose contract has come due, decides to join them in brotherhood on the picket lines. But I had an awful lot of help. People often think about the 150 or so people that went out on strike in that dispute. They don't think as much about the 550 people who remained at their posts. And let me tell you, they really dug deep. They worked long, hard hours, many of them in jobs that they had to be trained from scratch to do. I remember going down to that press room and watching men and women who worked in our business office, chartered accountants and bookkeepers in blue press clothes up to their elbows in ink, determined to get that paper out for one more day. Well, you know, I was so proud of that team. We did not miss a single day of publishing. The strike ended when the union voluntarily revoked its bargaining certificate in exchange for enhanced severance packages and our commitment to take anybody back who wanted to return. So when it all ended, there were about 50 people in that group of 150. There were about 50 who were crossing picket lines. On day one, 25 of them crossed. But by the time it ended, about 50 were crossing. About 100 were still out. So the 100 that were still out, 90 left, never, as far as I know, to work in the newspaper business again, and another 10 came back, and we welcomed them with open arms. We went on to make other significant decisions across the newspaper, and we set a record for earnings in Southam. I believe seniority language would have forever handicapped our future. You see, I thought we needed a place where the quality of a person's work determined their future and not how long they had spent on the job. When I look back at it all now, wouldn't do it any differently. But you know, turned out that that decision came with a price. When I made the choice, I knew there was risk in challenging that. I wasn't sure how our city, how our clients, how everybody else would receive it. So I knew there was real risk in making that choice. But I don't think I ever really appreciated how much being branded as a union-busting boss was going to cost me. And I know that it cost me a seat on a board that I was looking forward to because the major shareholder was the Ontario Teachers' Pension Fund. And I know that it's cost me elsewhere. But we only had one chance to get it right. Looking back on it now, I would make the same choice all over again. That decision, risky as it was, costly as it proved to be, was a key plank in the future that we were building together. I'm reminded a little bit of what Winston Churchill said. Churchill said, "Do you have enemies? Good. It means you stood for something." I have made a few enemies, and I'm comfortable with that reality. I don't want to leave you with the impression that every choice I made worked out just as I had hoped. You take risky choices, they're all going to work out in the best. I don't want to leave you with that choice. When our company was sold to CanWest Global, I found myself suddenly working for leaders, shareholders that I didn't have anything at all in common with. And I made another choice. I made a choice to contest much of what they wanted to do. Well, it won't surprise you. And I did that because I didn't think it was going to make the place better. And I had, at that time, 20 years invested in Southam. Now, it won't come as any surprise to you that that put me offside with my new bosses. So, with so much, on the line in 2003, I resigned my position. I remember I called my boss one day, who was now in CanWest Global and the director of the newspaper division, and said, "Well, Bob, the ride is over. We just have to talk about how we end it now." And I left a 22-year newspaper career that meant a lot to me. That said, I'm grateful that I never had the regret of leading people I really cared a great deal about in a way that I didn't agree with. In the end, I guess it kind of did work out, though. Not the way I had hoped, maybe with a little bit more pain than I had planned, but I think it kind of worked out. I like the premise, of what Henry Cloud wrote in a book he wrote entitled Necessary Endings. In that book, Henry just wrote about the idea that sometimes the best new beginnings are preceded by a necessary ending. And I've been able to spend 13 years now doing what I've always loved doing, helping people become better leaders. I don't want to leave you with the idea that I made reckless choices, and I'm not suggesting you should do that, because I don't think I did. I measured the alternatives carefully, and then I made thoughtful, if often risky, choices. I thought about how best to execute them, how best to approach them. I don't recall ever putting myself or my safety first in those choices. I also don't want to leave you with the idea that these risks were about gaining some sort of a tactical advantage. They were not. There was a common theme. Each time, I was doing what I sincerely believed would make the place better for everybody who was a part of it, for our employees, for our shareholders, and for our customers. In the epilogue of my little book, I reflected on a favorite movie, The Kingdom of Heaven. It stars Liam Neeson and Orlando Bloom. I think it might be the only Orlando Bloom movie I like, but anyway, I really do like this movie. Neeson plays the role of Godfrey of Ibelin. He is an aging knight. Orlando Bloom plays the role of Balian, and Balian is Neeson's illegitimate son, the only son he's ever fathered and the only heir he has. He's really never met this illegitimate son. So they meet for the first time when Godfrey of Ibelin, Neeson's character, goes back to this open-air blacksmith shop to reunite with the son he's never met. And he's going back with an invitation to invite him to the Crusades, and one day when the time comes, to succeed him as the Lord of Ibelin, his estate. And there, carved into the beam of Balian's humble open-air blacksmith shop, is his credo. And it reads, "What man is a man who does not make the world better?" Later, there's a scene I really like a lot. The father has passed away, and Balian the son has inherited the estate, Ibelin. He travels to Ibelin for the first time. They're standing on a balcony looking out over the estate, and his aide is giving him a kind of an inventory. He tells Balian that he has 1,000 acres, he has 100 families. He has Jews, Christians, and Muslims. He goes on to tell him that, he's got cattle and farming stuff, and Balian kind of looks out at the estate, and he walks down to the ground, and he scuffs his feet in the ground, and he looks at it, and he says, "But what we don't have is water." And so he gets off, and he grabs a shovel, and he leads the community in a project to dig wells and to build an irrigation system. He's down on the ground, getting very sweaty, very dirty, working alongside the people he leads, helping them in what will prove to be an important project. Later in the movie, there's a scene I like a lot. So the princess of Jerusalem comes to pay her first visit. And she rides in with her entourage. And she says to Balian, "I'm on my way to Cana, where Jesus turned water into wine." And she looks at him, and he's just a ragamuffin. He's been working all day. And she says, "But a better trick would be to turn you into a nobleman." And he looks back at her, and he says, "In France, a few yards of silk will make a nobleman." And I kind of like the way he draws the contrast between what a leader really is. It's not the clothes on her back. It's what she's doing. It's the work she's doing. It's a question of character. So he cleans up, and they have dinner, and she remarks, "I was watching you today. You would turn this patch of dirt into a new Jerusalem." And he looks at her, and remembering his credo, he says, "It's my land. Who would I be if I didn't try to make it better?" I believe this is the orientation of all good leaders. Wherever you are today, whether you're leading a group of 6 people or you're leading an organization, it's your Ibelin. Are you ready to turn it into a new Jerusalem? It's not going to be safe, and it's not going to be easy, but it is so worth the effort. We are facing some stiff economic challenges these days. It's likely there will always be challenges coming. Some will be greater, some will be lesser. There is no doubt this one is about an 8 on the Richter scale. The question is, though, what are you going to do? Will you choose to play it safe, or will you act boldly, taking the risks that are entailed to really make a difference? It's been said that a calm sea never made for a skillful sailor. These are the situations that test leaders and refine leaders. I'm not saying I always made all the right choices. I don't want to leave you with that impression. Only that I always made the ones that I believed would make the place better, and that I didn't put my own personal safety first in those. It's been 13 years now since I stepped away from newspaper for leadership development and the coaching work that I do now. And I've worked with hundreds of leaders over those years. And I am convinced that there are just far too many playing it safe. Tom, you and I were talking at the table before, and I was telling the story of where I think this talk maybe got its start. And it was 3 or 4 years ago where I was meeting with an executive coaching client. This was kind of a middle-level manager. And I was trying to help him get to the point where he could make what I thought were even just some modestly risky choices that were the right thing to do for his group, that would really make a difference. And every time he'd get up to the brink of them, he would step back. "I couldn't do that. How would Howard feel if I did that? What would the company feel if I did that? And I kind of sat back after that call, and it kind of all crystallized for me. And I thought, that's just not one call. I'm seeing too much of that. I'm seeing too many leaders who are more concerned with their own safety, with protecting their turf, than they are with really making a difference. I'm convinced there are too many playing it safe, folks. Here's the problem. They are robbing their teams of the important and adventurous work that they could be doing together. There are just too many who won't make the bold choices that it takes to really make a difference. So I'm going to just close with maybe an encouragement and one more story. As I was moving to Kingston, I ran into an old colleague from the Calgary area. Guy used to work at the Herald. And he said, I said to him, Sandy, I said, this Kingston thing I'm going, this integration, never done one. I said, not really sure how it's all going to go. And I said, it's been a couple years since I've been in that position. And he looked at me and he wanted to reassure me. He said, Dan, don't worry about it. Man, you'll nail it. You got it. You'll nail this thing. And I looked at him and I said, no, you don't understand. I said, I'm excited about the idea that I don't know how it's going to go. You see, I think that that's what real transformational leadership is about. I think it's about you being willing to put yourself out there one more time, not really knowing the outcome, willing to make an enemy if you must, willing to do what you think needs to be done to make the place better. So let me just close by saying I believe that this kind of leadership is what people everywhere want. I think they are so tired of mind the store, play it safe leaders. Sometimes, I think in the 13 years that I've been writing about leadership now, I've been studying it my whole life. It's always been a passion for me. But in the years since I've been writing about it and looking at different organizations and looking at different companies, I sometimes think we form the impression in this world we live in that nobody really wants to be led anymore. I don't believe that that's true. I think everybody wants to be led someplace better. The problem we have today is too few leaders who can see better, have a vision for better, who can describe it to their teams and have the energy to take them there and the courage to take them there. I think that people everywhere want men and women with vision and courage who will take them on an adventure to do something worth doing. These are the leaders that people everywhere want to follow. And this is the opportunity that I think is standing right here for you if you just reach out and take it. Thank you.